So I just got an email from someone who was asking me, when should we begin writing, the writing process? So this writer had done a lot of the research and the backstory and the plotting. They kind of felt like they were ready to start writing, but they weren't really sure. So the question was, how do I know if I'm ready to start writing? And my response was, personally, I don't do a ton of backstory. I did when I was like trying to figure out how to write a book. Plotting helped me a lot. Like when I was able to plot a whole story and I knew what was going to happen, it made it so much easier for me to go through and actually finish the book. But what I also said was that you never see everything that's going to happen in the story until you get there, until you're like halfway through it and you figure out what's not working. That's when you have to fix things. So like you can't predict the plot holes, all the plot holes before you start writing, or character motivation is a big one. So like maybe you have a plot and you need your characters to do something, but there's no reason for them to do something, or it's unbelievable. Like why would they do that ridiculous thing unless you have really strong motivation? So motivation is just putting in enough backstory or adding something to your story architecture so that the protagonist or the main character, so they have a real reason to be doing what they're doing. And generally this is conflict building. So if you don't have conflict in every chapter between your characters, it's going to be a boring story. But you have to build that conflict by giving each character some specific motivation, probably based on their history. To try to figure all that stuff out before you start writing the book would be really, really challenging. So what you do is kind of you make a basic plot outline. You write about a chapter for every scene. So maybe in each you write a paragraph for each scene. So maybe in each chapter you have 2 or 3 scenes and you write a paragraph about what happens in that scene. Like these characters do this, they go here, they're trying to do this. Like the setting and what happens in every scene or every chapter, something should happen, something should change. Generally there's a balance between like they try to do something, they learn something, they make a new plan, they try to do something again. So for the first half of the book, it's mostly reactive, things are happening, and the main characters are just like responding. And at the second half of the book, they're doing more things with decision. So they are trying, they understand what's going on and they're trying to take action to fix things, but everything they do leads them deeper in the hole, puts them further behind the antagonists until the final conflict or the final battle. But so my response to the writer was, you really have to start, like I don't think you should start, I'm not a pantser. I don't think you should just start and figure out your story, because if you figure out your story and your characters while you're writing, you're going to end up, you may not necessarily end up with a really messy story, but a lot of authors do. I know experienced pantsers who can just write a whole book and it's great. And they don't do any real plotting or planning. That's just how they tell stories. And you can, like with enough practice, you can develop that skill set. But I think if you're an inexperienced writer and you haven't written several books already, you may get stuck with pantsing and you may write a really messy story that takes you years to edit, and you can never really, like you have this big messy draft and you can never really fix it because it's so broken because you didn't plot it. So for me, plotting really helped a lot. But when you have a basic plot, you kind of have to start writing to figure out the details, because a lot of the story you won't really see. I like to have a very clear ending. I usually know where my end point ends up. I know the final battle scene. I know what's involved and how that works. So most of my story is just getting people from the beginning to the end so that the end matters. Like the ending won't matter unless there's a lot of emotional investment in the characters, so they know what the stakes are and they know why it matters, whether like who wins or who fails. It has to actually matter to your readers. So that's kind of what the whole story is about. So if you're not sure whether you're ready to start writing, I think if you have a plot, I think you should start writing. I don't think you need the character map of like the whole backstory or the history of all of your characters. I know there's a lot of writing exercises where you do like a spreadsheet for each character to know what's going on with them. I don't think that's very important. If it works for you, that's fine. But I also think that like that kind of organization or research can be detrimental if it keeps you from ever writing the story. Because I know you could waste lots of time playing around with, the planning phases. If you're a planner and a plotter, you like that kind of stuff. And and it feels like work, but you're not actually doing anything. You're not actually writing anything. So you need to, especially if you've never written a book before, if you've never written a rough draft before, at some point you need to start writing. And that's just a matter of sitting down, looking at your draft, or which is just your plots with a short paragraph for each scene, and you just take that paragraph and you write through it. And that's, I'm not a confident drafter. I'm not very good at writing the first rough draft. I'm very good at revising and editing, but it takes me a long time to write the first draft. But that's something you kind of have to force yourself to sit down and write. So I'll set a timer for like 50 minutes. And I'm not a fast drafter, so I might get 1,000 words done in 50 minutes. But if I do 3 hours a day and get about 3,000 words a day, which is a lot. If I do it consistently for a month, I can write about a book in a month, and then you just revise it and edit it. And because I'm a plotter, and because I've done my plotting pretty well, I don't have to spend a lot of time on revision. I do a couple of revisions to clean up the draft. Like when I'm writing the first draft, I'll probably skip a lot, or I'll skip anything that's really hard. Or if I have any story questions, I might just leave a note to myself to be like, you know, I need to make this make sense. I have to add something here. The second time I read through it and I fix things, I'll notice any big problems, or I'll comment to myself on things like, you know, what are they wearing? What's the setting or the description? I add a lot of the clothing and setting description and background. I add a lot of that stuff in the second or third draft because I think that's important, but you don't want to waste time describing stuff in the first draft if things are going to change around anyway. So you really want to focus on the action, like what actually happens in the first draft, and not worry too much about the rest of the details. I also think, like the dialogue, for example, you want to put some dialogue down, you know, the best you can come up with at the time. But dialogue is one of those things that gets better in the second or third draft when most of it's pretty clean. And you're trying to think of like, how can I make this cooler? How can I make my characters cooler by adding, you know, witty banter or whatever. So if you can't labor over trying to figure out your witty banter the first time because you don't really even know your characters very well. So just get things down, do a quick rough draft, try to get through like what happens, but know that you're going to go back and polish things and fix things later. So, and then also in the second or third draft, like I said, I'll leave comments. So I'll notice things like, you know, am I capitalizing this word? Am I putting these numbers in numerics or in alphabetical? Yeah, am I spelling out the numbers? Things like, am I calling it 100 euro or 100 euros just for consistency issues? Things like what color my character's eyes are, because I may accidentally make one blue or green or change. So I just want to check and make sure I'm saying the same thing. And also that like my whole story makes sense. So if I mention something, like if I described a scene in the beginning of the book, I want to make sure I'm in the same place at the end of the book. Because sometimes when you're on your way through it, you may shift things around in your mind and you start to describe things differently than you were describing in the beginning. So anyway, I think you should start writing your book. I think you can't know everything about your book until you've written the first rough draft, but I think you should have plotted enough so that when you get through your first draft, the core structure is going to stay the same. And you can still add some things to it and improve it and fix it, but you're not going to be moving stuff around. The other thing I'll caution against, which is a common mistake from new writers, is that you don't want to have any scenes that are just there for what's the word? Like if you've made a scene that you like, but it doesn't actually do anything. If it's like tourism, it's literary tourism where, for example, in this book I'm editing now, the first 15 chapters, not very much happens. So a lot of it is literary tourism, which means the characters are just looking around the scenery, commenting on stuff, or eating lunch together, or like having a little discussion, or talking about the philosophy or the backstory or the history, sharing information with the reader. That's all amateur writing. So I'm trying to fix it as much as I can, but because I wrote it, you know, it was one of my first books, I just made a lot of those mistakes. Those aren't things I can completely fix because that's just the story that I wrote. I would have to rewrite the whole story. So you want to be careful against doing stuff like that. If this is your first rough draft and you haven't written a book yet, you want to make sure there's conflict in every character, in every chapter. A lot of conflict, a lot of stuff that's happening. That doesn't mean action all the time, but there has to be tension. There has to be characters at cross purposes who are working towards things and they can't get what they want. There can't just be people chatting and hanging around and exploring the world because that's really boring. So if things aren't happening and moving forward in every chapter, that's a sign that that chapter needs to be cut. So you need to be careful about not just enjoying the process. Like if you're just enjoying the process and you're writing to yourself, you're like, wow, this place is so cool. These characters are having so much fun. And you're just like, you're having fun with the characters, but it's kind of showy. Like you're showing off, these characters are awesome and they're in this background, but they're not doing anything and there's no danger and there's no threat. There's no conflict. Those are weak scenes. Those are going to be really weak, slow chapters that don't contribute to the plot. So watch out for those if this is your first draft, because you're probably going to have to cut those later. And once they're in, it's really hard to cut them because you're going to like them a lot. So you may, if you have an editor, your editor is going to probably tell you to take them out, and you may have trouble letting them go or killing your darlings because, you love that, that world you built, those backgrounds, those characters, you love the interaction, but it's not necessary for the story. And your readers aren't going to appreciate it as much as you do. Anyway, so maybe this video helps a little bit. You can't do everything perfectly the first time, and your first draft is always going to suck. Everybody's first draft always sucks. The best you can do is try to make your final draft, like once you get through the book and you've written a first draft, then you can edit it and polish it so that your final book is less sucky, but it's always still going to be your first attempt, and your first attempt is always never going to be the best book in the world. And that's something you kind of have to deal with as a writer. You're building your craft. Your first book, maybe your first 5 books, are kind of practice. So even if they're not bad, even if your readers kind of like them, you should be aware that you need to get better, and you will be getting better as long as you look at your earlier work and you recognize it's not your best, and you force yourself to learn and to grow and to strive for, it doesn't have to be perfection, but it has to be, figuring out what you did wrong and doing better in the future, which is a process I'm going through now. It's painful, it's difficult, it's a little embarrassing to notice, like, my first books aren't that great. But that's a common issue with any skill set that you're developing. Writing is difficult and challenging, takes a lot of practice. People say you need to write 1 million words to have some competency in writing books specifically. If you may be a great writer, but if you've never written a book before, it's a whole different ball game, and you'll get better. So I wrote a post called In Defense of Am Writing, or In Defense of NaNoWriMo, a couple years ago, which you can look up. And basically, I was saying that you have to write to get better at writing. You have to write and publish to get better at writing. So it's fine that you're not perfect, but you can't just spend 5 or 10 years trying to make something perfect. Like, I know a lot of literary people who think they are going to write the next great literary novel, so they never finish anything. They never finish any book. They never publish anything. They consider themselves a writer, but they won't publish an imperfect project, which means they never finish a book and put it out there. And if you're not putting stuff out there quickly, you won't get feedback, you won't grow your audience, you won't figure out the mistakes you're making. And that's a problem too. I think you'll get better faster if you're putting out not necessarily low quality products, but just you're building things faster and you're putting them out there faster. So you shorten the feedback loop, which means you finish things and people tell you whether or not they liked it. You figure out what you did wrong. You try again. Unless you're consistently trying to do better with new projects, you're never really going to grow as fast as you could. And I wanted to grow as a writer really quickly rather than trying to write a perfect novel. And I think I've done pretty well at that. I've written some novels I don't think are great, and I have a much better understanding of what will sell with commercial fiction. So I'm much more confident, and I've been doing this for 2 years, so I'm much more confident now about the books I'm going to write, and I can write a book that's going to sell really well in much less time because I've been putting things out more quickly without spending a lot of time trying to make them perfect. Anyway, so when should you start writing? I would say write a quick outline so you know basically what happens. Write a basic chapter outline so you have, and even if you don't write a complete chapter outline, you can download my plot dot structure, which is only like the 12 major turning points that most commercial fiction has. And those, like, you don't have to plan out every chapter, but if you at least plot your 12 main turning points, so you have some basic core structure that's going to satisfy 95% of the commercial reading audience, that's going to help you a lot. So start with those big turning points, figure out how those work, and then you can just fill in the gaps and figure out what needs to happen between them. Thanks, bye-bye.